You can tell a great deal about a person by what they leave behind after everyone stops watching. The lunch crowd at Maple Street Diner had finally begun to thin when the black luxury sedan pulled quietly away from the curb, disappearing into the steady afternoon traffic without fanfare. Most customers had never realized who the man in the tailored charcoal suit really was until he walked out the door. One whispered his name. Another searched for his picture online. Within seconds, conversations drifted across the restaurant like invisible waves. Benjamin Hayes, billionaire, investor, one of the wealthiest men in the state. Grace Mitchell gathered empty coffee cups onto her tray, moving with the practiced rhythm of someone who had worked too many double shifts to count. At 32, she knew better than to stare at famous customers or expect extraordinary tips simply because expensive watches flashed beneath crisp shirt cuffs. Bills still needed to be paid whether a customer drove a pickup truck or a luxury sedan. Her 7-year-old daughter, Lily, would be waiting after school in less than 3 hours, and Grace still had another evening shift to finish before picking her up. She smiled politely at a retired couple asking for fresh coffee, cleared another table, then walked toward booth 12 where Benjamin Hayes had finished lunch only moments earlier. The leather seat was still slightly warm. His coffee cup sat nearly empty beside a neatly folded linen napkin. Everything about the table reflected quiet discipline. No crumbs scattered across the wood. No mess. No unnecessary waste. Grace collected the plate first, then reached for the check presenter resting beside the salt shaker. She opened it almost absent-mindedly. Her smile faded. Tip, $0. For a brief second, she simply stared at the receipt, wondering if perhaps the payment had not processed correctly. She checked again. The bill had been paid in full. The tip line contained a clean, unmistakable 0. Behind the counter, another waitress noticed her expression. What happened? Grace quietly handed over the receipt. Within moments, the paper passed from one employee to another. Eyebrows lifted. Heads shook. Someone let out a dry laugh. A billionaire leaves nothing, one cook muttered through the kitchen pass window. Guess that is how people stay rich. Another server crossed her arms. I have had college kids leave better tips after splitting one burger. Even a customer seated nearby overheard the conversation and frowned toward the empty booth. Grace listened without joining in. She slipped the receipt back into the check holder and placed it carefully on her serving tray. The restaurant manager approached, disappointment written plainly across his face. You gave good service, he said quietly. Sometimes people forget what this job means. Grace offered a small smile that never quite reached her eyes. Maybe he had his reasons. The manager looked unconvinced, but said nothing more before returning to the register. Grace picked up a damp cloth and began wiping the tabletop in slow circles. Outside, sunlight reflected across the diner windows while cars rolled steadily down Maple Avenue. Inside, the conversations continued. Everyone seemed certain they already understood the story. The billionaire had been cheap. The waitress had been unlucky. End of discussion. Grace kept cleaning without another word. Years of raising Lily alone had taught her something most people never learned. The quickest judgment was rarely the truest one. She reached for the heavy ceramic dinner plate that had covered part of the wooden tabletop during lunch. As she lifted it carefully with one hand, something beneath the plate caught her eye. A plain white envelope lay perfectly flat against the polished wood, hidden where no one could have seen it until the table was cleared. Grace stood perfectly still, the damp cloth resting forgotten in her hand while the plain white envelope remained hidden beneath the dinner plate. It carried no name, no company logo, no handwritten message on the outside. It looked ordinary enough that anyone else might have assumed it was simply an old receipt left behind by mistake. She glanced toward the front windows. The black luxury sedan had already disappeared into afternoon traffic. Around her, the restaurant continued moving with its familiar rhythm. Orders were called from the kitchen. Coffee refills crossed the dining room. The front door chimed as another customer stepped inside. Yet somehow the small envelope seemed to quiet everything inside her mind. One of the other waitresses noticed her standing beside the booth. What is that? Grace looked down before answering. I'm not sure. The waitress leaned closer with immediate curiosity. Open it. Grace gently slid the envelope into her hand instead of tearing it open. It does not belong to me. The other waitress laughed. If somebody leaves an envelope under a plate after giving a $0 tip, I think they wanted you to find it. Grace remained unconvinced. She carefully turned the envelope over. It was still completely blank. Her manager walked over after noticing the small gathering around booth 12. Everything all right? Grace quietly held up the envelope. This was underneath his plate. He frowned with surprise. Did you open it? She shook her head. Not yet. The manager studied her for a moment before speaking. It was left on your table. I suppose it is yours now. Grace smiled politely, but did not move. Or perhaps it belongs to someone who expects to come back. The manager folded his arms. You really think a billionaire returns for forgotten envelopes? Grace answered with quiet honesty. I do not know. That is why I should not decide for him. The conversation ended there because another family needed menus, and Grace returned to work with the envelope resting carefully inside the pocket of her apron. She served burgers, poured iced tea, refilled ketchup bottles, and carried fresh slices of apple pie without mentioning it again. Every now and then her fingers brushed lightly against the unopened envelope, reminding her it was still there. Curiosity whispered louder each passing minute, but something stronger continued holding her back. Late that afternoon, her shift finally ended. She changed into a light sweater, gathered her worn canvas tote bag, and walked toward the employee lockers at the back of the diner. Several coworkers were already changing clothes before heading home. One smiled knowingly. You still have not opened it. Grace quietly placed the envelope inside her locker beside a framed photograph of 7-year-old Lily smiling with 2 missing front teeth on the first day of 2nd grade. No. Another waitress looked genuinely confused. What if there is money inside? Grace gently closed the locker door. Then it will still be there tomorrow. What if it is something important? Grace picked up her keys. Then the owner deserves the chance to ask for it. She locked the small metal door with a soft click. The sound echoed faintly through the quiet staff hallway. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, the sky had already begun turning shades of orange and pale blue. She climbed into her aging sedan and drove toward Lily's elementary school, where children were laughing across the playground while parents waited near the front entrance. Lily spotted her mother immediately and ran over carrying a backpack almost half her own size. How was work? She asked cheerfully after fastening her seatbelt. Grace smiled warmly. Busy. Lily tilted her head. Anything interesting happen? Grace looked through the windshield for a thoughtful moment before starting the engine. Maybe, she answered softly. But sometimes the most important things should wait until the right person is there to hear the story. The next morning arrived with the quiet certainty of routine. Dawn painted pale gold across the windows of Maple Street Diner, while fresh coffee filled the air with its familiar warmth. Grace unlocked her employee locker before tying the white apron neatly around her waist. The plain white envelope rested exactly where she had left it the evening before, untouched, unopened, and somehow heavier than paper should have felt. She slipped it carefully into the apron pocket without looking inside. It did not belong in a locker forever. It belonged with the man who had left it behind. Throughout the breakfast rush, she found herself glancing toward the front door more often than usual. Every time the bell above the entrance chimed, she looked up expecting to see the familiar charcoal suit walk through the doorway. Instead, truck drivers stopped for eggs. Before work, teachers grabbed coffee on their way to school, and an elderly couple shared one slice of blueberry pie exactly as they did every Tuesday morning. Life continued exactly as it always had. By mid-morning, one of the waitresses leaned against the coffee station with a playful smile. Still carrying that mystery around? Grace nodded. Yes. You are the most patient person I have ever met. Grace poured fresh coffee into a customer's mug before answering. Or maybe just the most stubborn. They both laughed softly, but the conversation ended when another order arrived from the kitchen. Just before noon, the manager stepped into the dining room, carrying his tablet. Grace, he called quietly. Someone reserved booth 12 again. She paused only for a second. The same booth. Requested specifically. Her heartbeat quickened, though she kept her expression calm. She folded fresh silverware into a linen napkin and walked toward the booth, making sure every glass sparkled and every place setting sat perfectly straight. A few minutes later, the familiar black luxury sedan stopped outside the diner. Benjamin Hayes stepped through the front door exactly as he had the previous afternoon. He wore the same quiet confidence, though today there seemed to be something thoughtful behind his steady eyes. He greeted the hostess politely before taking his seat without looking around the room. Grace approached carrying a glass of ice water. "Good afternoon." Benjamin looked up and smiled politely. "Good afternoon." There was no mention of the previous day. No explanation. No apology. She placed the menu in front of him. "Would you like your usual?" He seemed slightly surprised that she remembered. "Yes, please." As she turned toward the kitchen, her fingers brushed against the envelope resting inside her apron pocket. During the next 20 minutes, she served his lunch exactly as she had before, never treating him differently because of his wealth or because of the unanswered questions waiting between them. When he finished eating and reached for the check, Grace quietly placed the plain white envelope beside the leather bill holder. "I believe this belongs to you," she said gently. Benjamin looked down at the envelope. For the first time since entering the diner, the calm certainty in his expression disappeared. He slowly lifted his eyes back to hers. "You did not open it." Grace shook her head once. "No." He studied her face as though searching for the smallest sign of hesitation or dishonesty. Finally, he asked another quiet question. "Not even a little?" Grace smiled softly. "Some things are worth more unopened than explained." For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Around them, the diner remained busy with ordinary conversations, clinking dishes, and the scent of fresh coffee. Yet inside booth 12, something invisible had shifted, and Benjamin Hayes suddenly realized that the woman standing before him had already answered the question he had never written inside the envelope. Benjamin rested one hand lightly on the unopened envelope while the afternoon sunlight stretched across booth 12, painting long shadows over the polished tabletop. He did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he looked at Grace with quiet disbelief, as though the answer he had been searching for had arrived in the simplest way possible. "May I ask you something?" he said softly. Grace nodded. "Of course." He glanced at the envelope again. "Were you never curious?" She smiled gently before answering. "Every day." Benjamin tilted his head slightly. "Then why did you not open it?" Grace folded her hands loosely in front of her white apron. "Because curiosity belongs to me. Ownership belongs to someone else." The words settled between them without hurry. Benjamin let out the faintest breath of a laugh, not because the answer amused him, but because it surprised him. Most people would have convinced themselves they had earned whatever was inside. Grace looked toward the front window where a father was helping his little boy climb out of a pickup truck. "Life has already given me enough reasons to choose the harder thing." Benjamin slowly picked up the envelope and turned it over in his hands. "There is a letter inside," he admitted. "There is also a cashier's check." Grace remained completely still. Her expression did not change. She did not ask for the amount. She did not even look at the envelope again. Benjamin noticed immediately. "You are not going to ask how much." Grace answered almost absent-mindedly as she straightened the salt and pepper shakers on the table. "If I needed to know yesterday, I would have opened it yesterday." He watched her for another long moment. "Do you know why I left it?" Grace met his eyes with calm honesty. "No." Benjamin leaned back against the booth. "For years I have wondered whether people notice me or my money first. Every time I leave an unusually large tip, I receive gratitude. Every time I arrive somewhere, people recognize my name before they recognize my face. I wanted to know what someone would do if there appeared to be nothing to gain." Grace listened without interrupting. "The $0 tip was intentional," he continued quietly. "The envelope was never about generosity. It was about character." Grace lowered her eyes briefly before speaking. "Then I hope you found the answer you were looking for." Benjamin smiled, though there was sadness behind it. "I found an answer I stopped believing existed." The diner continued around them as though nothing remarkable had happened. Plates moved from kitchen to tables. Coffee steamed beneath warm lights. Conversations rose and faded like gentle waves. Yet inside booth 12, neither of them seemed aware of anything except the quiet honesty filling the space between them. Grace finally broke the silence. "Would you like me to take the envelope now that you have it back?" Benjamin looked down at it again before carefully sliding it across the table toward her. Grace frowned slightly. "I thought you said it belonged to you." "Yesterday it did," Benjamin replied. "Today it belongs to the woman who proved she deserved to choose whether to open it." Grace gently pushed it back toward him. "Respectfully, I cannot accept something that began as a test." Benjamin did not argue. Instead, he slowly nodded, as though her refusal confirmed something even more valuable than her honesty the day before. For the first time in many years, he realized he was sitting across from someone who had not measured him by the size of his fortune, and Grace quietly realized she was sitting across from someone who had finally decided to stop measuring people by the choices he expected them to make. Benjamin left the diner a few minutes later carrying the same envelope he had arrived to reclaim, but something about the way he stepped into the afternoon sunlight had changed. His shoulders no longer carried the guarded stiffness Grace had noticed the day before. He paused beside the black sedan before looking back through the diner window. Grace was already serving another table, smiling politely as she refilled coffee cups and carried fresh sandwiches to a family of 4. She had returned to her ordinary routine without once glancing toward the door to see whether he was still watching. Benjamin quietly shook his head to himself. Wealth had introduced him to thousands of impressive people. Character had introduced him to very few. Inside the diner, the lunch rush continued as if nothing unusual had happened. One waitress hurried past Grace, carrying a tray stacked with burgers. "So," she whispered, "what was inside the envelope?" Grace balanced 2 bowls of soup before answering with a gentle smile. "Something that belonged to someone else." Her co-worker blinked. "That is all." Grace nodded. "That is enough." The answer puzzled everyone who overheard it, but nobody pressed further because another order bell rang from the kitchen. By the time Grace finished her afternoon shift, the conversation had already drifted toward other customers, weekend plans, and rising grocery prices. She picked up Lily from school exactly as she did every weekday. The little girl climbed into the passenger seat carrying a handmade paper flower from art class. "Guess what?" Lily asked excitedly. "Mine was the only flower that stayed standing." Grace laughed softly. Maybe it had strong roots. Lily looked proudly at the colorful paper craft resting on her lap. "Mrs. Parker said good things usually grow slowly." Grace smiled at the familiar truth. She sounds very wise. That evening, their small apartment smelled of tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches. Lily finished her homework at the kitchen table while Grace folded laundry nearby. The apartment was modest, with worn wooden floors, secondhand furniture, and family photographs filling nearly every empty wall. Nothing matched perfectly, but everything had a place. After dinner, Lily disappeared into her bedroom before returning with a small glass jar filled with folded pieces of colored paper. She placed it carefully on the kitchen table. "Memory jar," she announced proudly. Grace smiled. "Another school project?" Lily shook her head. "No. Every time something good happens, we write it down and fold it up. When we have a bad day, we open one." Grace gently removed the lid and looked inside. Tiny blue, yellow, and pink slips of paper rested together like little promises waiting for difficult days. "Can we add one tonight?" Lily asked. Grace hesitated for only a second before picking up a pencil. She thought carefully about everything that had happened during the past 2 days. Not the billionaire. Not the envelope. Not the unanswered questions. Instead, she wrote only 6 simple words. "Doing the right thing feels peaceful." She folded the note into a neat square and dropped it gently into the jar. Lily smiled with quiet satisfaction before placing the lid back on top. Across town, Benjamin sat alone in his spacious study overlooking the city skyline. The unopened cashier's check still rested inside the envelope on his desk. He slowly removed the handwritten letter he had prepared days earlier, reading words that suddenly felt incomplete. The test had ended, but the lesson had only begun. He reached for a fountain pen, turned the letter over, and began writing a new note beneath the first one. This time, it was not designed to measure another person's character. It was written because someone had quietly changed his own. 3 days passed without another visit. Yet Benjamin Hayes never truly left the quiet corners of Grace's thoughts. Not because of his fortune, not because of the envelope, but because she had never seen someone look so relieved after being told no. Every afternoon she returned to Maple Street Diner, tied the same white apron around her waist, greeted familiar customers, and carried plates from the kitchen with the steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack of her life. Lily continued filling the little memory jar one folded note at a time. One evening she added, "The moon looked like a smile tonight." Another day she wrote, "Mom laughed when I burned the toast." Grace never corrected her spelling or her uneven handwriting. She simply watched the jar become fuller with ordinary moments that somehow felt priceless. Late Friday morning, a delivery driver arrived carrying several heavy boxes addressed to the diner. The manager frowned as he signed the paperwork. "We did not order anything this week." The driver shrugged politely. "Everything is prepaid." Curious employees gathered around while the boxes were opened. Inside were brand new coffee mugs, fresh serving trays, replacement silverware, and a commercial espresso machine that looked far newer than anything the diner had ever owned. Taped to the largest box was a simple note. For the people who serve others every day. No company logo. No signature. Only those few words. The manager looked genuinely confused. Did someone donate all this? Nobody knew the answer. Grace quietly carried a stack of new mugs toward the counter without saying anything. Something about the note felt familiar, but she refused to guess. The following week brought another surprise. A local newspaper published an article praising Maple Street Diner as one of the most welcoming family restaurants in the county. Within days, new customers began stopping by after reading the recommendation. Weekend mornings became so busy that every booth filled before 8 o'clock. Families waited outside for tables. Travelers passing through town chose the little diner over larger chain restaurants. Tips improved naturally because business improved naturally. No one customer changed everything overnight. Instead, dozens of ordinary people quietly walked through the front door one after another. The manager smiled more often than Grace had ever seen. One afternoon, he gathered the staff together before the lunch rush. "I can finally give everyone a raise," he announced. The dining room erupted with grateful applause. Grace lowered her eyes for a moment, thinking of Lily's growing feet and the pair of new school shoes she had quietly postponed buying twice already. She whispered a simple thank you to herself without knowing exactly whom she was thanking. That evening, while locking the front entrance after closing time, Grace noticed a familiar black sedan parked discreetly across the street beneath an old maple tree. It remained there only a few seconds before pulling quietly away into the evening traffic. She never saw who sat behind the wheel. Across town, Benjamin stood inside his office watching photographs from a recent community newspaper spread across his desk. One picture showed the smiling diner staff standing beside the new espresso machine. Another captured children laughing over milkshakes beneath the restaurant's bright windows. He folded the newspaper carefully before placing it inside a drawer. His assistant entered carrying several business folders. "Would you like your name included in the donation records?" she asked. Benjamin shook his head. "No." She hesitated. Should the restaurant ever know? Benjamin looked out the window toward the city lights beginning to glow against the evening sky. "If kindness needs a signature before it matters," he said quietly, "then it was never kindness in the first place." Autumn arrived quietly, bringing crisp mornings and amber leaves that drifted across Maple Street like handwritten notes from another season. Business at the diner remained steady, not because of luck, but because families kept returning. They recommended the little restaurant to neighbors, co-workers, and travelers passing through town. The staff noticed the difference in small ways. The coffee rarely sat long enough to grow cold. Fresh pies sold out before evening. Children recognized Grace by name and waved excitedly when she walked toward their tables carrying a tray balanced carefully on one hand. She never asked why life had suddenly become a little easier. She simply worked with the same quiet gratitude she had carried long before anything changed. One Saturday afternoon, Lily sat in her favorite booth near the front window coloring pictures while waiting for Grace's shift to end. The little memory jar rested beside her backpack, now nearly full of folded notes in every color imaginable. One of the regular customers noticed it and smiled. "What is in the jar?" Lily answered proudly. "Good days that we do not want to forget." The customer chuckled warmly. "That sounds like something grown-ups need more than children." Grace overheard the conversation while pouring coffee nearby. She smiled without interrupting. Sometimes wisdom arrived in voices too young to realize they were speaking it. Just before closing, the manager walked out of his office holding an envelope. "Grace, this came for you." She wiped her hands on her apron before accepting it. There was no return address, only her name written neatly across the front. Unlike the first envelope she had found beneath the dinner plate, this one was clearly meant for her. She opened it carefully. Inside rested a single folded sheet of cream-colored stationery. There was no check, no business card, only a handwritten letter. She recognized the handwriting immediately. "Grace, thank you for returning something that did not belong to you. More importantly, thank you for reminding me that trust cannot be purchased, tested forever, or negotiated. It can only be received as a gift. I once believed generosity meant giving people more than they expected. You quietly showed me that real generosity sometimes means expecting nothing in return. The restaurant is stronger today because many good people work there every day. I only helped remove a few obstacles that should never have existed. Please do not thank me. Instead, keep doing what you have always done. There are more people watching than either of us realizes. Grace folded the letter slowly, reading the final sentence twice before slipping it back into the envelope. She did not tell anyone who had written it. She simply placed it inside her canvas tote beside Lily's school papers. Later that evening, mother and daughter walked through a neighborhood park where maple leaves covered the sidewalks in shades of gold and red. Lily carried the memory jar carefully with both hands. "Can we add another one tonight?" she asked. Grace nodded. They sat together on a weathered wooden bench beneath a tall tree. Lily handed her a small blue piece of paper and a pencil. Grace thought for several quiet moments before writing only one sentence. "The greatest gifts are the ones that change who we become." She folded the note and dropped it gently into the nearly full jar. As the paper settled among dozens of other ordinary memories, Grace realized something she had not understood before. The letter in her bag mattered less than the woman she had become because she never opened the first envelope. Across the city, Benjamin stood alone beside the window of his office watching evening lights appear one by one across the skyline. For the first time in many years, success no longer felt measured by quarterly reports or investment portfolios. Somewhere in a small diner, a single mother had unknowingly restored something wealth had never been able to replace, and that quiet truth stayed with him long after darkness settled over the city. Winter arrived earlier than expected that year, covering Maple Street with a light blanket of snow that softened the familiar sidewalks and parked cars into quiet shades of white. Inside the diner, the windows glowed with warmth while strings of simple holiday lights reflected softly against the glass. Customers lingered a little longer over hot coffee, grateful for a place that felt less like a restaurant and more like a neighborhood living room. Grace moved between the booths with the same steady smile she had carried through every season. She still wore the same neatly pressed white apron. She still remembered every regular customer's favorite breakfast. The difference was not in how she worked. The difference was in how the world had quietly begun responding to her kindness. One snowy afternoon, an elderly man entered the diner carrying a cane and shaking snow from his coat. Before anyone else noticed him, Lily, who was finishing a school assignment in the corner booth after classes, quietly stood and held the front door open until he reached the entrance. The man smiled warmly. "Thank you, young lady." Lily shrugged with complete sincerity. "My mom says people should never have to carry everything by themselves." Grace overheard the exchange while delivering bowls of soup to another table. She looked toward her daughter and felt something quietly settle inside her heart. Children rarely repeated what adults said. They repeated what adults lived. Later that afternoon, the manager gathered the staff together near the front counter. The Chamber of Commerce announced the finalists for this year's community service recognition. He said with an excited smile. "Our diner made the list." Applause filled the room. One cook slapped another on the shoulder while several servers laughed in disbelief. Grace simply smiled and returned to polishing silverware. Recognition had never been the reason she came to work every day. Across town, Benjamin attended a meeting inside a glass conference room overlooking the city skyline. Executives discussed quarterly reports, expansion plans, and investment projections while charts filled enormous display screens. Benjamin listened politely before his attention drifted toward the snow falling outside the windows. Numbers suddenly seemed strangely quiet compared to the memory of a small glass jar filled with folded pieces of colored paper. Without thinking, he excused himself for a few minutes and stepped into the hallway. He called his assistant. "Please make one change to next week's schedule." "Of course," she replied. "What would you like to add?" Benjamin looked through the window at families walking together beneath umbrellas. "Nothing important," he answered softly. "Just lunch." The following Tuesday, shortly after noon, the familiar black sedan stopped outside Maple Street Diner once again. Grace noticed it through the front window, but continued pouring coffee for a customer before walking calmly toward the entrance. Benjamin stepped inside carrying nothing except a winter coat dusted with snow. He chose the same booth without requesting it. Grace placed a menu in front of him even though they both knew he would order the same lunch as always. Their eyes met briefly. Neither mentioned the letters. Neither mentioned the donation. Neither mentioned the envelope that had quietly changed 2 lives. Some conversations had already said everything they needed to say. As Grace turned toward the kitchen, Benjamin noticed the nearly full memory jar resting on a shelf behind the register where Lily had placed it after school. He smiled to himself, realizing that somewhere between a forgotten envelope and an ordinary lunch, both of them had begun measuring wealth in completely different ways. Snow continued falling gently outside Maple Street Diner, covering the sidewalks in fresh white while warm light spilled through the front windows onto the quiet street. Benjamin finished his lunch exactly as he always did, folded his linen napkin neatly, thanked Grace for the meal, and reached for the check. This time, he left an ordinary tip before standing to leave. There was no test, no hidden envelope, no quiet experiment waiting beneath a plate. Grace picked up the check presenter only after he stepped outside. She glanced at the receipt, smiled softly, and slipped it into her apron pocket without counting the amount. Some victories no longer needed numbers. Before Benjamin reached his car, the diner door opened again. Lily hurried across the sidewalk, holding the little glass memory jar carefully with both hands while Grace followed several steps behind. Benjamin stopped, curious. Lily looked up at him with complete sincerity. "Mom said I should be the one to give this to you." Benjamin accepted the jar with gentle hands. Inside rested dozens of tiny folded slips of colored paper collected throughout the year. He looked toward Grace with quiet confusion. "I cannot take this." Grace smiled warmly beneath the soft winter light. "You are not taking it forever." Benjamin waited. "Open one whenever you have a day that makes success feel empty," she said. "Then bring it back when someone else needs it more than you do." He looked down at the simple glass jar. It contained no money, no contracts, no signatures, only ordinary moments carefully preserved because someone believed they should never be forgotten. Benjamin slowly removed one folded blue note. He looked toward Grace for permission. She nodded once. He unfolded the tiny paper with careful fingers. In Lily's uneven handwriting were 6 simple words. "Somebody smiled because Mom smiled first." Benjamin read the sentence twice before quietly folding it again. His eyes lingered on the little girl standing beside her mother in the falling snow. "This may be the most valuable gift I have ever received," he said softly. Lily grinned. "Just remember to give it back someday." Benjamin laughed, a quiet laugh filled not with surprise, but with gratitude. "I promise." Grace watched the moment in silence. Months earlier, she had refused to open an envelope because it belonged to someone else. Today, she freely gave away something priceless because it belonged to everyone. Benjamin carefully placed the memory jar inside his coat instead of the back seat of the luxury sedan. Somehow it felt safer there. Before opening the driver's door, he turned toward Grace one final time. "Do you know what changed everything?" he asked. Grace looked at the snowy sidewalk, then back at him. "No." Benjamin smiled gently. "It was never what was inside the envelope." He paused as snowflakes settled quietly across his coat. "It was the person who chose not to open it." Neither of them spoke after that. They did not need to. Benjamin drove away slowly while Grace and Lily stood together beneath the glowing diner sign until the black sedan disappeared beyond the curve of Maple Street. The little girl slipped her hand into her mother's. "Do you think he will bring the jar back?" she asked. Grace looked toward the quiet road before answering. "I think kindness always finds its way home." Behind them, customers laughed over fresh coffee. Waitresses carried warm meals from the kitchen, and another ordinary day continued inside the little diner. The world had not changed because a billionaire left money on a table. It had changed because 2 strangers quietly reminded each other that character is the only treasure that grows larger every time it is shared.